The weight of the silver wine bottle was a familiar comfort in her hand. Adaeze moved through the private dining room the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, invisible. 3 years of working events in Seoul had made her that way. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and nobody looked at her twice. That was the job. She was behind the serving partition when she heard it. Not a shout, a whisper, the kind that only comes from someone who has never needed to raise their voice. Sign it tonight, or your sister's scholarship disappears by morning. Both of them. Adaeze did not move. Through the lacquered screen, she watched a powerful man lean over an 18-year-old girl and wait for her to break. The girl, Park Soyeon, had smiled at Adaeze in the elevator earlier. Most guests never did. Adaeze set the bottle down. She stepped around the partition. "Miss Park," she said, in a calm, almost bored voice, "your car has arrived." There was no car, but Soyeon stood. She followed. They were in the service elevator before anyone in that room could react. Adaeze got the girl into a cab, pressed enough cash into the driver's hand, and watched the taillights disappear into the Seoul night. Her old life disappeared with them. Adaeze Nkechi Okafor had come to Seoul on a full scholarship from a Nigerian Korean exchange program. She was 23, a third-year economics student at Yonsei University, and she paid her bills by working private events on weekends. Her dormitory in Sinshan had one working radiator. Her meal budget needed careful planning every week. She had grown up in Enugu, Nigeria, in her mother's busy fabric shop at New Haven Market. That was where she had learned to listen, really listen, to people who thought nobody was paying attention. It was also where she had learned that the most useful thing you could know was something nobody knew you knew. Adaeze spoke Korean, fluent, street-level Korean, the kind picked up in back corridors and supply rooms over 3 years of working events. Not a single person in Seoul knew this. She planned to keep it that way. The call came 48 hours later. Adaeze was in the university library, pen in hand, working through a paper on prospect theory, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, Seoul area code she didn't recognize. "Miss Okafor." Not a question. Someone who already knew where she was. "Yes." "There's a car outside your building. Be ready in 20 minutes. The line went dead. She checked the call log afterward. 11 seconds. No name, no explanation, no return number. She went back to her dormitory and changed into her second-best clothes, the ones she wore when she needed to be taken seriously. She was ready in 14 minutes. The car was a matte black Genesis G90. The driver didn't speak. They headed south toward the Han River, moving through streets where the buildings got quieter and more expensive with every block. In Seoul, she had learned, the wealthiest places had the least to prove. No signs, no noise. Just space and silence, and the kind of calm that costs a great deal of money to maintain. The building they stopped at had no name on the front. She had learned that was its own kind of language. She was taken to the 32nd floor. Not the penthouse, 3 floors below it. That gap felt like a choice someone had made carefully. The room was a study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, one long window facing the river, a desk holding nothing but a glass of water and a closed folder. Kwon Jae-han was already seated. She had seen him across a crowded dining room. She had not seen him like this, in full light, still, with nothing between them. He was the kind of person people called handsome when they were really trying to describe something harder to name. Lean in a way that came from training, not hunger. A thin scar along the left edge of his jaw, faint enough to miss, noticeable enough to remember. He wore a dark navy suit with no tie. He looked like he hadn't slept. He didn't stand when she walked in. She noted that. She sat down without being invited to. He noted that. "You were hired through a third-party agency," he said, "which means you passed 3 rounds of background checks. You have worked private events in Seoul for 2 years and 9 months. You are a scholarship student at Yonsei, behavioral economics, 3rd year, top 12%. He paused. "Your scholarship is partially funded by the Kwon Cultural Foundation." She had not known that last part. She kept her face still. "I did not know that," she said. "I do now." He opened the folder, did not slide it across to her. "Your events contract has been cancelled. Your agency account has been closed." A pause. "Chairman Yoon Byung-cheol has influence over both." "I expected that." "He also has a connection to 2 members of your scholarship committee." That one landed. She kept her hands flat on the table. "What happens to Park Soyun's scholarship?" she asked. Something moved across his face. Very small, almost nothing. "It's been secured. That was handled separately." She thought about that. The chairman had gone after Adaeze instead of the girl she'd protected. Either Soyeon had some kind of protection Adaeze didn't know about, or Kwon Ji-haen had stepped in. She was fairly sure it was the second one. "Why am I here?" she asked. He slid the folder across to her. She opened it and read every page. He waited without moving. It was a contract, 6 months, with options to extend. The pay was more than her scholarship by an embarrassing distance. Housing, transport, and living costs all covered. Her job title was written in 3 words: Special Research Consultant. "What does this actually mean?" she asked. "It means I need someone with a specific skill that my regular staff cannot provide." "I was a waitress." He looked at her directly for the first time. "You heard a conversation in Korean you were never meant to hear. You understood every word. You acted immediately, at great personal cost, without asking anyone for permission." He paused. "That is not something a person does by accident. That is something a person does because they have been paying attention for a very long time." The room was quiet. "You speak Korean," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion he had already reached. She said nothing. "The people I need to watch," he continued, "do not know I have someone who speaks Korean, Igbo, English, Yoruba, and French. They will not expect the person sitting beside me to understand a single word they say." Adaeze looked back at the contract, at the money, at the start date, then at page 7, buried under a block of legal language she almost skipped. "Consultant agrees not to disclose any information acquired in the performance of duties for a period of 10 years following contract termination." She looked up. "That contract will bury you," she said quietly. "Not me. You. If anyone finds out what you're using me for, the legal risk comes back to the foundation. You've attached this arrangement to a registered entity." She turned to page 4. "Line 19. You should have used a personal holding structure." He was very still. "I won't sign this version," she said, "but I'll tell you exactly what I would sign, and who you need to call to write it." The silence shifted. It had a different weight now. He reached across the table, closed the folder, and said, "Tell me." The apartment on the 31st floor was the most beautiful place Adaeze had ever been unhappy in. She moved in 4 days after signing the revised contract, a document she had restructured herself, adding a clause that required 30 days written notice before either side could end the agreement. The Kwon legal team spent 18 hours reviewing it. They approved it without a single change. That told her something useful. Kwon Ji-haen's people were careful and thorough, but they were not creative. Creative thinking was exactly what he had hired her for. The apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Han River, a kitchen with equipment she didn't fully know how to use, a wardrobe that had been filled before she arrived, her size, conservative cuts, expensive fabrics, the kind of clothes that said, without speaking, that the person wearing them belonged in serious rooms. She had tried to feel insulted by this. She hadn't entirely managed it. The silk blouse alone cost more than a full month of her scholarship allowance. She was given a daily schedule, briefings at 8 in the morning, meals in a private dining room 1 floor up, a driver, a research database, and a phone registered to a company name she didn't recognize. She was not told who she was allowed to speak to. She was not allowed to leave the building without first informing a man called Team Leader Shin Do-gyun. She didn't ask whether these were rules or just suggestions. She watched instead. By the third day, she had noticed 4 things. The first was the staff. The household workers spoke to each other in a mix of standard Korean and Jeju dialect, a regional variety most people on the mainland didn't understand. She could follow about 60% of it. She began paying closer attention and quietly filling in the gaps. The second was Jaehan himself. He ate alone. Every single meal in a room by himself, with the door left slightly open. There were 20 staff members in that residence. He ate as though none of them existed. She didn't know yet what to do with this observation. She filed it away. The third was a photograph. On the east wall of his study, tucked behind a wooden panel she only noticed because it sat an inch closer to the window than the wall's design suggested, was a photo. She could see just the corner of it from the hallway. A child. A woman. The colors had faded the way photos from the early 2000s always did. The fourth was the light under his study door. He worked past 3 in the morning on 3 of the first 4 nights. On the 4th night, the light went off at 11. She noticed because she had been working late herself, and the sudden darkness under his door felt different from the ordinary quiet of the building. She didn't try to make sense of any of it. She simply let it build. She sent her weekly update to her academic supervisor, who believed she was on a private sector research placement. She wrote to her mother in Enugu to say she was fine, that Seoul was cold, and that she was learning things no textbook had ever taught her. Her mother wrote back, "Be careful of people who offer you everything. They are usually counting." Adaeze printed the message and pinned it to the mirror above her desk. The meeting was about money, the way most dangerous things are. Heir Media was a mid-size entertainment company, and its founding family had been doing 2 things at once: quietly selling off their voting shares while loudly announcing a 5-year growth plan to anyone who would listen. Kwon Jae-han needed to know what the family's head, director Lim Hyung-jun, was actually planning before Kwon Money was committed to a deal his own team had already signed off on. Adaeze was brought along as his research associate. Nobody introduced her by name. She was expected to sit in the corner, take notes, and disappear into the background. She sat in the corner. She was not paying attention to being ignored. She was watching Director Lim. Not his words, his behavior. The meeting was held in Korean, with a professional translator made available. Jaehan turned the translator down. He used his own interpreter instead, a Kwon staff member named Hong Kyaesuk, whose translations were technically accurate and missed the point of almost everything. Director Lim, who believed he was sitting in a room full of people who couldn't follow a word of his private conversations, leaned toward his attorney 3 times during the meeting and spoke in fast, quiet Korean. The first time, he adjusted his offer. The second time, he reconsidered Kwon's timeline. The third time, he mentioned a company based in Busan, briefly, carefully, and referred to it only as the other arrangement. Adaeze wrote down all 3 conversations in Igbo. Nobody asked about her notes. Nobody asked her anything at all. On the drive back, Jaehan glanced at her notepad once, then at her face. What language is that? Igbo. Can anyone else in this building read it? No. He was quiet for the length of 2 bridges. What did he say to his attorney? She told him everything. She watched his face as she spoke. He didn't react the way powerful people usually did when they received news they weren't expecting. No wide eyes, no sharp intake of breath, no performance of surprise. It was quieter than that, like a small internal adjustment. A compass needle that had been slightly off finding its proper direction. The Busan company, he said, is a second acquisition target. He's running 2 negotiations at the same time. She paused. He plans to accept your offer and use it as pressure to get better terms from the second buyer. You're not the deal, Mr. Kwon. You're the leverage. He said nothing. Move your offer deadline up by 4 days, she added. Force him to decide before the second buyer confirms. Once that window closes, he has nothing to bargain with. He turned and looked at her fully for the first time since the meeting began. She held his gaze. "You've been doing this," he said slowly, "in every room." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He turned back to the window. Seoul moved past outside, red and white lights on the highway, towers that never fully went dark. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "You didn't ask what I was doing," she said. "You told me to sit in the corner." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. She noted it and said nothing. "Don't sit in the corner at the next meeting," he said. She was returning from the building's internal archive at 9:14 p.m. when she saw that her apartment door was open. Not broken, not forced. The lock had been bypassed the clean way. The kind of clean that meant professional tools and someone who knew exactly how to use them. That kind of work cost money. She did not go inside. She pressed her back flat against the corridor wall, took one slow breath, and sent a single character to the number saved as emergency, Shin-DG in her phone. A full stop. Nothing else. She had set up this code with team leader Shin on her 4th day in the building, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone. 40 seconds later, a man walked out of her apartment. She knew him. She had memorized the seating arrangement at the Yonhwa Tower dinner. He had been sitting 2 chairs to the right of Chairman Yoon. He walked past her without slowing down. He didn't see her. She was behind a structural column with her back to the wall, which meant either she had made a good decision or she had been luckier than she had any right to be. She counted to 20 after he turned the corner. Then she moved. She was 2 doors down, heading for the service stairwell, when she heard footsteps behind her. Fast. Deliberate. Getting closer. She turned left into a maintenance corridor she had memorized from the building's floor plan on her 2nd day. 30 feet in, she reached a locked electrical panel door and entered the override code she had quietly obtained from one of the Jeju dialect staff members. The right question, the right moment, the right language. The footsteps behind her stopped. She stood still and said nothing. 40 seconds passed. Then the light in the corridor shifted. Someone had opened the door she had come through. A voice, male, 2 short syllables. Then a second voice, closer, lower, and she recognized it immediately. Kwon Ji-han passed the narrow maintenance window above the electrical panel. She had half a second to see him clearly. He had come down from the 32nd floor himself. Dark jacket, no tie. The expression on his face was nothing like the one he wore in meetings or briefings. It was harder than that. More direct. The voices outside went quiet. There was a short stretch of sound she chose not to think too carefully about. Then silence. Then 3 slow knocks on the maintenance door. "Okafor," his voice flat and even. "It's clear." She opened the door. He was alone. The corridor behind him was empty. He looked at her, calm, unhurt, still holding her archive documents in her left hand, because at no point had she put them down. He looked at the documents, then at her. "The override code," he said. "Day 2, she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite irritation, not quite respect. Somewhere between the two. And she was beginning to understand that the space between those 2 things was where Kwon Ji-han spent most of his time. "Come upstairs," he said. "I need to file these first," she said, holding up the documents. He stared at her. She filed them. He waited. The problem arrived 10 days later in the shape of a lawyer. Attorney Woo Sang-pil worked for Director Lim, and his relationship with the law was similar to a person's relationship with a building they had lived in for decades. He knew every room, every corner, and more importantly, every wall that wasn't load-bearing. He didn't break rules. He found the ones that could be quietly removed without the whole structure falling down. Somehow, Woo had gotten hold of a partial transcript of the Haewon media meeting. It was incomplete. The 3 exchanges Adaeze had recorded in Igbo were missing entirely. But what he had was enough to threaten a breach of confidentiality claim against the Kwon Foundation. He wasn't interested in actually filing it. He was interested in what the threat of filing it could get him. What he wanted was simple. He wanted the Quan team's internal projections for Haewon Media. Private financial information. In exchange, the transcript and the threat attached to it would disappear. He sent this message through a third party. Not to Kwon Jae-han's device. To hers. Adaeze sat with it for 17 minutes. She thought about page 7 of her contract and the 10-year silence clause. She thought about her mother in Enugu. She thought carefully about everything she had already given up and everything she had not yet lost. Then she called team leader Shin. "I need to speak to Mr. Kwon directly," she said, "not through anyone else. He's in a board meeting until—" "Tell him Attorney Wu sent a message to my device," she said. "He'll come out." He was out of the meeting in 4 minutes. She walked into his study and told him everything. The exact wording of the message, what the timing told her, what the delivery method told her, what Wu actually wanted, and what she thought the right response was. Then she told him one more thing. "He knows I speak Korean," she said. "The transcript mentions a third party with an undisclosed language ability. He doesn't have my name yet, but he's working toward it. If I stay visible, I become a problem for you within 2 weeks." Jae-han said nothing. He was very still. "The simple answer," she said, "is that I go back to the dormitory. I return to being a student. You lose a resource. I lose the contract. But the foundation stays clean, and Wu has nothing solid to use." "And the other answer?" he asked. "I become the distraction," she said. "We let him find me. We let him discover that this mysterious third party is just a Yonsei economics student with a clean record and no formal ties to the Kwon acquisition team, which is completely true." She paused. "When he comes after me, he'll have to show his hand. You'll see exactly how deep his connection to the Lim operation goes." "That's using you as bait," he said. "Yes." "That's not in your contract?" "No." He looked at her for a long time without speaking. "You understand what you're offering," he said finally. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a compliment. It was something quieter, the recognition of a person who had just watched someone else place something irreplaceable on the table and push it forward with both hands. "I understand," she said. What she didn't say out loud, if it went wrong, the clean record was gone. The scholarship was gone. The careful plan she had been building since she was 15 years old, the paper she would one day write about her mother's ability to read a room, all of it gone. She looked at him steadily. "Set the timeline," she said. 3 weeks after the Wu operation ended, they were in the study at 1:30 in the morning. The Lim family had settled. Haewon Media was now, quietly and without any public announcement, a Kwon portfolio company. The paperwork that had been destroyed during the decoy operation had been rebuilt from scratch, and tonight they were working through the last of it. The city outside had gone down to its bones, the lights that never turned off, the towers that never fully slept. Inside the study, the only sounds were the occasional turn of a page and the low hum of the building around them. Adaeze had been reading the same clause in the secondary agreement for 12 minutes when she became aware that she was no longer reading it. She looked up. Jae-han was watching her, not studying her the way he did in meetings, measuring and calculating. Just watching. She had learned the difference between the two. It had taken her a while, but she knew it now. "Why are you still here?" he asked. She set the document down. "The contract has 44 days remaining," she said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. "I told myself I stayed because the work was interesting," she said, "and because the alternative was a dormitory with one working radiator." She paused. "But that wasn't the whole truth. I was lying to myself about at least part of it." He said nothing. She looked at him. "Why did you come down from the 32nd floor yourself? That night in the maintenance corridor. You have an entire security team." 3 seconds of silence. "Because it was faster," he said. She held his gaze. "That's also not entirely true." He didn't look away. He didn't shift in his seat or reach for something to do with his hands. "No," he said quietly. It isn't. The room felt different after that. The document sitting on the desk between them suddenly seemed like it belonged to a different conversation entirely, one that had nothing to do with what was actually happening in this room at 1:30 in the morning. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched out slowly, the way moments do when both people in a room are aware of exactly how much is being left unsaid. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. She didn't see the name, but she watched something change in the way he was sitting. A quiet straightening, a subtle shift, the careful reassembly of the version of himself that belonged to the daytime world and business hours and rooms full of people who needed things from him. He answered it, turned slightly away. Adaeze picked up the document. She found her place. She went back to reading. Neither of them said a word about what had just happened, but both of them knew exactly what it was. The Limwu Coalition had one move left. They used it well. It didn't come through a courtroom or a legal notice. It came through the scholarship committee, specifically through two members who had a quiet, long-standing relationship with Chairman Yoon Byung-chul. A formal complaint had been filed against Adaeze Nkechi Okafor, Yonsei University exchange student, citing conduct violations during her private sector placement. The complaint was written carefully, vague enough that she couldn't easily disprove it, specific enough to trigger an automatic review that would freeze her scholarship while the investigation ran its course. The review was set for Thursday. It was currently Tuesday. Adaeze sat across from Jaehan and walked him through everything she had found. It took 15 minutes. The complaint was built by two people, she said. Yoon's contacts provided the pathway, but the specific wording in Section 4, the part about unauthorized information transfer, that language belongs to someone who understands how academic committees work. That's Wu. She turned her laptop so he could see the screen. He also made a mistake. He used the same legal phrasing from the Heir Media Confidentiality Clause. Paragraph 3, Subclause B. It's an unusual structure. I found it in 9 different documents Wu authored over 12 years. She had spent the previous 48 hours building a side-by-side comparison. Original documents, matching phrases, patterns of language that pointed back to a single writer. If you take this to the dean of the international faculty, she said, the complaint falls apart under its own review. The committee will see that it was fabricated. The scholarship gets restored, and Yoon's 2 contacts on the committee get exposed. They'll be gone within a semester. He studied the screen for a long moment. You built this, he said, over 48 hours, while you were still under contract. The contract is active for 11 more days, she said simply. This protects you, he said, not the foundation. The foundation doesn't need protecting, she said. The Haewon deal is clean. Wu has nothing left to use. She looked at him. This is just the last piece. He was quiet. You could have taken this to the dean yourself, he said. Yes. Why didn't you? She looked at the comparison document on the screen between them. Because if I walk in alone, it's a student's complaint against a chairman's network. It gets buried. She paused. You have the institutional weight I don't have. I have the analysis you couldn't have built. Those are 2 different things that only work if they're together. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. We do. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. By Thursday morning, the complaint had been formally withdrawn. Its 2 architects had apparently discovered, quite suddenly, a prior commitment that made it impossible for them to continue serving on the scholarship committee. What Adaeze understood, sitting alone in her apartment that evening, was that something in her had permanently shifted. The girl who pressed herself behind columns and memorized floor plans and wrote notes in a language no one else could read, the one who had made herself invisible because invisibility felt like the safest way to survive. That version of herself had done everything she was built to do. She had served her purpose. Adaeze did not mourn her. 6 weeks later, Adaeze's scholarship was not only back, it had been increased. The dean called it a long overdue review of exchange program compensation structures. Adaeze decided not to look too closely at that explanation. Some things were better accepted than examined. She was back at Yonsei, third year. Top 6% of her class now, which surprised even her. The previous 42 days had done something to the way her mind worked. She was sharper, faster, less willing to accept the surface of anything when she could see the structure underneath. On a Wednesday afternoon, she was in the university library, annotating a paper on information asymmetry in closed negotiation environments, which was, she was aware, a very specific thing to be studying, when her phone buzzed on the desk beside her. A message. No greeting, no explanation. Just an address, a time, and one line of text. "There's a meeting Thursday. Sit wherever you want." She read it twice. Then she placed the phone face down on the table, picked up her pen, and looked at the paper in front of her. The note she wrote in the margin was technically about behavioral economics. She knew it was also about something else entirely. On Thursday, she arrived early. The room was already set up. Long table, chairs arranged down both sides. The kind of soft, even lighting that looks effortless and costs a great deal to achieve. Staff moved around the edges of the room in that particular quiet way, peripheral and professional, trained to be present without being noticed. She recognized that training. She had lived inside it for 3 years. She looked at the table. She chose her seat. Not the corner. She set her folder down, straightened her chair, and waited. The other attendees arrived in ones and twos, taking their places without much conversation. Nobody questioned where she was sitting. Nobody looked at her the way people used to. The brief glance that registered her presence, and then moved on, filing her away as unimportant. She was not invisible anymore. She was simply early. Kwon Jae-han was the last to enter. He came in without anyone announcing him, the way he always did, and the room responded the way it always did. A subtle shift in posture around the table, a collective settling, the quiet reorganization of a space around the person it had been waiting for. She had watched this happen the very first night she had ever seen him. It still worked exactly the same way. He moved to the head of the table. He sat down. He looked at her. She looked back. The morning light coming through the windows was gentle and steady. Not the cold silver weight of a wine bottle in a late-night dining room. Something warmer than that. Something that felt, in a way, she didn't try to put into words, like it belonged to her. Like she had always had a seat at this table. Like she had chosen, with both eyes open, to stay.